Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of BackBeat, the behind-the-scenes look at Newsbeat, the unconventional podcast taking a look at conventional wisdom. I'm Mike Conforti, aka Manny Faces, the producer of Newsbeat, and I'm here, as always, joined by our editors, Chris Twarowski and Rashed Mian. This time we're here to talk about our episode AUMF, the latest weapon in America's illegal perpetual war. And we talk about the AUMF specifically, the authorization for the use of military force, but we do want you to know that this is the latest weapon in America's illegal perpetual series of wars that have been going on for 75 years or so. We're going to get into the kind of behind the scenes of the episode. If you haven't heard the episode already, this is the director's cut. So there's spoilers throughout. You want to go back and check out that episode, AUMF, on our website, www.usnewsbeat.com, or wherever you subscribe to your favorite podcasts. Just look up Newsbeat. Find us, subscribe, listen, and then jump back here and we'll talk about how we came to put this episode together. Gentlemen?
So first, maybe just a little color about the creation of the episode. We had our little Newsbeat road trip.
That's right.
Up to Boston,
Mass. Yeah, one of the nation's premier luminaries of social justice and social commentary, Dr. Cornel West, was featured in this episode. We had a great time talking with him up at the campus of Harvard University. He's a professor of, what is it?
Practice of public philosophy.
Yeah.
Sounds smart.
And of course,
he is.
He's taught at Princeton, and he's just been on the forefront of some of these issues for a very long time.
I think he was in Matrix. I don't know how that fits in, but he was definitely in Matrix.
The movie.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
I'll look it up.
All right. So Dr. West shared some great insights with us while we were on the road. We also have, in this episode,
Elizabeth Beavers,
right,
who we interviewed through Zencastr, who's foreign policy manager at nonprofit Indivisible, formerly of Amnesty International USA.
Right.
And of course, we have U.S. Army Captain Nathan Smith, who actually reached out to us. I think reached out to Rashed.
Yeah, so Chris and I have been reporting on this AUMF thing for a couple of years now, and Nathan, when he was deployed in Kuwait, I guess you actually came across some of our stories, and he found me. He emailed me first, then he hit me up on Twitter. It was a weird time. I wanted to do a story on Nathan, but it was a weird time where Chris and I were leaving the newspaper where we came from, and we were starting the Newsbeat podcast, and we weren't really sure how we would tell his story, but it sort of worked out because we definitely wanted to talk about how America and the U.S. Congress specifically hasn't declared war since World War II. So it worked out.
Yeah, and Nathan was the one, as you hear in the episode, who, as an officer, sued the Obama administration to basically, to protest,
Yeah, I mean, and as you'll learn in the episode, the U.S. Constitution dictates that the U.S. Congress is the sole body who can declare war.
Right.
And yet, the last time it has done so was World War II. So we think back, we think about Vietnam.
Right.
We think about Korea.
Right.
We think about
all the mini conflicts along
Panama,
the way. Right.
Millions of people that have been killed, displaced.
Right. Yeah, the original Iraq War.
The original Iraq War.
Right, for sure.
And so, it begs the question, well, how have we been waging these wars for over 75 years? And what's authorizing, facilitating our current conflicts, especially since 9/11, which is in the title of the episode, AUMF, the Authorization for Use of Military Force, passed just 3 days after 9/11.
Yeah, so as one of our guests says, there was sort of a rush to war, obviously, after we were attacked on 9/11, where 3,000 people died in Lower Manhattan, in Pennsylvania, in Washington, D.C. So obviously, Americans as a whole are calling for some sort of response. And what we ended up with was this AUMF. Since then, it's been criticized as overbroad because, now we could wage war basically wherever we want because of it. But initially, when the Bush White House went to Congress looking for an authorization, they had reached out to Congress and proposed an AUMF that was, at that point, considered really broad, and Congress pushed back. So the ironic thing is they had this legislation that they turned down saying, no, we're not going to give you this much leeway to fight war. Yet it turns out that they did when they approved the AUMF 2001, which only one congressional representative voted against, and that was Barbara Lee of California.
Yeah, and so getting back to Nathan Smith, I mean, here's a guy who's has taken the oath, and you'll hear the oath in the episode, to, quote, support and defend the U.S. Constitution. Well, the U.S. Constitution dictates that Congress can only declare war, so he found himself waging a war, fighting in a war with so many other countless U.S. servicemen and women that is not authorized by the U.S. Constitution.
It's off the books.
So what did he do? He sued the Obama administration on grounds of constitutionality.
Yeah, I think Nathan Smith is the perfect example, because the way Nathan got into this because he read an article from Bruce Ackerman. He's a professor, I believe, at Yale, constitutional law professor. And he wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine in which he argued that U.S. service member could potentially sue the White House, the executive branch specifically, saying that by waging this illegal war, it's actually going against the oath that he took to defend and support the Constitution. And Smith took that to heart. And I think it's also important to mention that Smith, in our interview with him, said, I'm not a pacifist. He actually thinks, that we should be fighting ISIS. He calls them a reprehensible enemy. But the way in which we're doing it, to him, is anathema to the oath that he took, as Chris mentioned.
As he says in the episode, the process matters. Also mentioned in the episode, which is interesting, that multiple administrations, this isn't a Bush thing, this isn't an Obama thing, this isn't a Trump thing now, because all three presidents have been using this AUMF to justify all kind of military action around the world. And I think it was Elizabeth Beavers who pointed out that don't think that this doesn't matter to U.S. citizens. In fact, there was a U.S. citizen that was mentioned passingly in the episode that was a victim.
That they can also kill U.S. citizens with AUMF.
Right, and
has reported on that pretty
without going to
extensively.
court, too, without, obviously, actually charging these people. So first, I'll take the first thing where you talk about the three presidents. Yeah, it started with Bush, and it escalated under Obama, and now President Donald Trump has this authority to wage war wherever he sees fit. And I think the reason why Chris and I were reporting on this so much back in the day is that here was Obama, a guy who was a constitutional law professor. And I think Americans sort of saw Obama as a guy who had a moral compass, who wouldn't take us into a war that wasn't necessary, who would do the right thing. But, what he did is establish a precedent. All the drone strikes that he's proved and justified it by citing the AUMF. These are all things that President Trump can now do and even go even further. And in terms of the U.S. citizen who was killed, his name was Anwar al-Awlaki. His family was from Yemen, but he was born in the United States, I think in New Mexico, in 1971. And he actually started raising his family here. And after 9/11, he sort of became a radical cleric where he would give these sermons that would draw a huge following, especially on YouTube. And eventually, al-Awlaki left. He went back to Yemen and, according to the U.S. government, became a pseudo-leader of the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen. It's referred to as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And they sort of had their sights on him. So it was in 2011 September 30th, 2011, that when al-Awlaki was driving in a car with actually another U.S. citizen. His name is Samir Khan, who was born in the United States. He spent time on Long Island in New York and also moved to North Carolina before he himself fled to Yemen. And he was sort of the guy he was the editor of their extremist magazine called Inspire. It's widely read among extremists in the Middle East and throughout the world. And the United States government dropped a drone on that car, killing al-Awlaki and Samir Khan. The United States says Samir Khan was not targeted in that strike. He was, just basically a bystander. Collateral damage. Al-Awlaki, though, was targeted. 13 months prior to his death, the U.S. government created a secret legal memo that sort of was their justification for killing him. So basically, you had the United States government creating its own legal justification for killing a U.S. citizen without bringing any charges. This guy was not charged of any crimes.
Right.
Obviously, they were worried about his sermons and his role in inspiring extremists.
Right, but he wasn't an enemy combatant at the time or anything like that.
No, I mean, they viewed him, I guess they viewed him as one, but it wasn't on the books.
Let me just cut in. in no way does this mean that we or a lot of people are defending this guy or for what he did or what he was doing or who he was affiliated with. By no means, let's just get that on the table.
Yeah.
This is a bad dude doing bad things, and regardless how you feel about the politics. But there's a process in place for dealing with U.S. citizens.
Yeah, as you're saying, I mean, the U.S. government accuses al-Awlaki of being the leader and inspiring the man called the Underwear Bomber who tried to blow up a plane in Detroit. I think it was around Christmas.
I think it was on Christmas.
On Christmas, Day, several years ago. So they built up an investigation, but like I said, they never charged him. He wasn't brought to court, and he was slain. The thing about al-Awlaki is several weeks later, I believe, his son was also killed in a drone strike targeting another man. And then now when Trump takes office, al-Awlaki's daughter was killed as a bystander. So there's a lot going on here. But, obviously Americans are like, all right, he's dead because he was a member of Al-Qaeda. But the United States government has charged dozens and dozens of alleged terrorists, brought them back to the United States, prosecuted them in federal court, and got convictions. That's the appropriate way to do it under the law.
Right.
At that point, it wasn't. And why we're mentioning this now is because the justification in that legal memo, they cited the AUMF as the reason, saying that, quote, a decision maker could reasonably conclude that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula forces, of which al-Awlaki is a leader, are, quote, associated forces for the purposes of AUMF. And that brings us to another issue that a lot of critics have with AUMF, the Associated Forces Clause, that the government basically made up that doesn't actually exist in the 60 words of the AUMF.
And it's also been called, I think, the most dangerous sentence in U.S. history.
If people go back and read it, it's literally 60 words.
Right.
It's a 60-word authorization that we've been using for 16 years to justify everything from drone strikes in about 7 other countries, other bombing raids, the detention of enemy combatants at Guantanamo and other secret prisons. I mean, there's a slew of secret raids in sovereign countries where U.S. Special Forces would just go in and scoop somebody up, put them in a van, put them on a plane or a boat in international waters and leave them there. So this thing is extremely broad, and it's been used for a host of things, and it's literally only 60 words long.
We talk about the drone strikes a lot. Dr. West brings up the number of drone strikes that were ordered and carried out under the Obama administration. So the Obama presidency, in accordance with the AUMF and all the things we're talking about, dealt with the drone warfare a lot. Why was this method used so much? Obviously, they had the authority to.
They claim.
Right. Why was this? What was with drones?
So, I mean, I think there's a couple different reasons, but the use of drones, obviously, you don't have to necessarily put boots on the ground. Mm-hmm. You have machines doing the killing for you. Of course, people behind the machines, but they're not in the war zone either. So, the drone technology, safer and meant he could pull out U.S. forces from war zones. Also, I think the government argues that the drone strikes are more precise than other weapons.
Less civilian casualties.
Should mean less civilian casualties.
Right.
But that's not the facts.
Well, the government has claimed that drone warfare is more precise than dropping other munitions in places that may be highly dense or well populated. But so there's been several investigations into the casualties of drone warfare. There was an investigation done by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and they found that there were 10 times more drone strikes during Obama's presidency than under George W. Bush. And obviously that doesn't take into account other bombing missions, which are in the tens of thousands. It was in 2016, in the couple months leading to Obama leaving office, where the U.S. government finally, after human rights groups and civil rights groups and media organizations called on them to release their report on the number of civilians that were killed. And the government came back and said, between 64 and 116 civilians died as a result of drone warfare between 2009 and 2015. And independent monitoring groups have for years said that the number is just underreported. I mean, at that time, some said that the number of casualties from drone strikes is likely around 800 or even into the thousands. So we mentioned in the episode the wars across several different countries, including Yemen. It was Obama that started the drone warfare in Yemen. His first strike killed 55 people, including 21 children.
Yeah, I mean, and this speaks to this escalation that we mentioned that the AUMF has done. I memean, under Bush, and I believe Dr. Cornel West mentions this in the episode, we had 50 drone strikes, and under Obama, upwards of 540, with more than 26,000 bombs dropped in 2016 alone. Some independent organizations put the death toll of civilians at more than 2,200 killed by coalition raids since Trump was inaugurated.
Wow.
So that equates into 12 or more civilians killed every single day.
Wow.
During the Trump administration.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned with the so-called precision of these drone weapons, just recently, I recommend that everybody go and find this article and read it. The New York Times Magazine published an amazing investigation just a couple weeks ago in which one of the reporters actually spent 18 months on the ground in Iraq and I believe Syria as well, going door to door where there was drone strikes that were questionable, where people claimed that innocent civilians had died. And at the time, according to her report, the U.S. government was claiming that only 1% of drone strikes in the ISIS war led to civilian casualties. And as she went door to door and documented all this for 18 months, she found that the actual number is upwards of 20%. So 20% of the deaths in the ISIS war are civilians. And that's important because, again, this is an undeclared war that is being fought on the premise that America is protecting its interests and the interests of Iraqis, in the interests of Syrians, which the U.S. government claimed. But we're going ahead and slaughtering innocent people who, some of them are living under ISIS rule. But
right.
There have been reports of journalists interviewing people and human rights organizations interviewing people and them saying that they're actually more afraid of the drones buzzing overhead than of ISIS themselves. So this is one of the reasons why we need to keep questioning the legality of these wars and things that like drone warfare, which the government claims leads to less civilian deaths. But it might be less civilian deaths, but people are still dying.
Right. It's the effectiveness of this method of combat. And as we know from our previous episode, Chelsea Manning collateral murder cover-up, the U.S. government has a little bit of a history of not letting everyone know when they accidentally kill civilians. So it's something to keep an eye on. Bringing it back to the fact that Congress, as we learned in middle school or high school, that Congress is really the body that's supposed to declare war, that the power, as we talked about in the episode, isn't supposed to rest with one man. In the infamous words of Kanye West, no one man should have all that power. And I think our forefathers were thinking of Kanye when they wrote the Constitution. So let's take it back to what the congressional representatives are doing, if anything, to take on the AUMF, to repeal it, to rewrite it, to just raise flags about it. We did play in the episode the clip of Barbara Lee, the congresswoman from California, the sole member of Congress to vote against the measure originally. Has she remained an opponent of the law? Is there any pushback on this? Are we the only ones talking about this?
I think all the three of us in the room are the only ones.
Barbara Lee, we need you.
And hopefully you listeners.
We need to invite her over.
Yeah, I mean, yes, she's still very much opposed. She and a small bipartisan group have been fighting to repeal the 2001 AUMF. Some have called for repealing and replacing it with a more limited measure, such as one that would maybe identify the organizations that the U.S. forces could fight.
Specific, like specify them.
Right. There was a push after the ISIS war began to pass an ISIS-specific AUMF, but that never materialized. The Obama administration even proposed its own AUMF, but they basically undermined it from the beginning by saying they believe the 2001 AUMF gives them all the authority they need to fight ISIS.
Right.
Basically then Secretary of State John Kerry said just that at a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, and the proposed ISIS AUMF went nowhere. And most recently, Barbara Lee tried to have the 2001 AUMF repealed, but an amendment that would have done so was stripped from a defense appropriations bill last July.
Of course it was.
Yeah, and I think, obviously this is all important, and it's important that Barbara Lee is still fighting for this, and it's actually amazing. For 16 years now, she's still in office. She's doing what she can to raise awareness, and she actually got that amendment into that defense appropriation bill, which was a victory in and of itself, because that never even became close to happening over the last 16 years.
Right, but ultimately it was, no pun intended, it was shot down.
Yeah, congressional leadership stripped it out, and she's been yelling and screaming about it ever since. Look, if Congress wants to fight war, and the argument is then go and declare war. Or if you want to do another AUMF, then create another AUMF that the executive branch can use to prosecute this war.
Right.
No one's saying here, not to fight ISIS, not to fight Al-Qaeda or other groups, but let's make it clear who the enemy is. The ironic thing is America champions itself as, the leader in democracy. Other countries have passed their own authorizations to fight ISIS.
Right.
I think Germany was one of them. I think even Russia was one of them. But the U.S. government still can't do it, and they're the ones leading this coalition fighting ISIS.
Right.
So, it's important for Americans, I think, to understand and think about Nathan Smith, who's saying, look, I think ISIS is a reprehensible enemy. I think we should fight them, but let's make it clear who the enemy is. When you don't, there's, who comes after ISIS? Is there going to be another group that's born out of, civilian casualties who wants to get back their cousin who died, their brother who died,
right.
and they create another organization? There's been rumors that Osama bin Laden's son is now taking the helm at Al-Qaeda, and that's how many years after he was assassinated in Pakistan. That's why it's clear, because there's these groups that keep growing, and they go into Yemen, they go into Somalia, they go into Libya, and it's just endless. If it continues like this, they're going to be spreading across the globe, and we're going to be going into countries that no one's ever heard of, like, say, Niger, where 4 U.S. service members were recently killed. One reportedly found with a wound in the back of his head, suggesting that he may have been shot in the back of his head.
Right.
And at that point, there was even some congressional representatives who said that they didn't even know that we were in Niger, which is sort of ridiculous because the government gives Congress reports saying, these are the countries that we're in,
Right.
So the U.S. government has taken a hold of Africa as a continent and is, creating military bases and trying to fight groups there. So that's why Americans need to understand what's going on. It's not that people are pacifists and don't want to fight these wars. It's that we should know why we're sending our servicemen and women to these different countries and potentially dying for a war that's not declared or Congress is too scared to speak out about.
How has the Trump administration engaged in military action and continuing this trend, increasing, decreasing? We know that, as you heard in the episode, we mentioned the bombing of Syria in response to chemical attacks there. How has military engagement changed under Trump?
Well, Chris mentioned that the reported 2,200 civilians who have already been killed since Trump took office. And that was a report published by Air Wars. There's been a couple of things that we've seen already that have been unprecedented. We saw the military for the first time ever use the so-called mother of all bombs against a small-scale ISIS affiliate in Afghanistan that the general public had no idea even existed. So at that point, people questioned, why are we using this bomb, which is the second most powerful bomb the U.S. government has in its arsenal, second to a nuclear weapon? It had never been used before. Not even when the U.S. was going after Osama bin Laden. We saw the videos, them bombing mountains and caves. It was never used then. The bomb cost millions of dollars to make. So, in effect, we're using taxpayer money, millions of dollars of taxpayer money, to drop a bomb against a small-scale affiliate of an ISIS group that we didn't even know existed. Trump said during the campaign that he was going to bomb the shit out of ISIS. I think he's actually lived up to that. That may be one campaign promise that he's actually lived up to. And look, it generated a lot of headlines. I'm sure you guys are like me scrolling through Facebook and Twitter on that day. All you saw was this mother of all bombs, and it was sort of celebrated.
Yep.
You had the aforementioned the bomb strike against the airstrip in Syria in retaliation for the alleged chemical attack by the Syrian regime against its own people. And that came on just in time when Americans were sitting around the living room, turning on their TV for primetime television. And all we saw on loop, basically, on TV networks was Department of Defense video of these bombs being launched into Syria. You had Brian Williams, who's now of NBC, calling it beautiful. You had other people talking about how presidential Trump appeared by bombing Syria. But nobody was talking about the legality of bombing a sovereign country without Congress actually doing something.
Right.
The next morning, you had some members of Congress, Tim Kaine, the Hillary Clinton's former vice presidential candidate, he spoke up. Some other people spoke up, but other people said, you know what? We're allowing the president to do what he thinks is right. We're not at war, but it was in retaliation for a heinous attack.
And I think that with all the ramping up that you're hearing about in the news now, regarding North Korea, for example, where if there was to be some kind of determination that we have to engage them militarily, it's again left up to essentially the president, who, and now there's been some talk about how much authority does he have to launch a nuclear strike, for example? And the answer is all the authority, pretty much. And you have the Secretary of Defense.
I think there are a couple people that came
There's a couple people,
they would refuse to.
So you have a couple of officials now who are saying, "Don't worry, America. If the president was to give us an illegal order, we wouldn't carry it out. Now we have to obey his orders, and that's a thing we're going to do. But if that order is illegal, we're not going to do it." But as we're talking about this entire episode, that would be considered legal, even though it's not, because Congress isn't the one deciding to drop a nuclear bomb on Pyongyang. Right? That one person is going to possibly make that decision based on whatever information or tweets they might feel is the justification, and there's nothing that anyone can do to stop that from happening. Yeah. That's a dangerous situation.
Yeah, I mean, leading up to wrapping up the episode, Rashed and I, were calling it a coup. The war-making power has now been centralized,
right,
really in the office of one man.
Right. Right.
So that is not what the Constitution intended.
Indeed. So that brings us back full circle, I think, to Nathan Smith and why his action and why he was, his voice, is so important. Again, I don't want this to be, we're talking anti-American stuff. We're talking protecting this nation, protecting our servicemen and women who are overseas, protecting our homeland, doing what we have to do, sometimes engaging in conflict. War is ugly. It's complicated. I'm not taking sides. We're not taking sides.
Doing it smart.
Right, doing it smart and doing it so that you don't have that kind of usurping of protections that were created for a reason.
We're questioning.
Right. So that brings us again to Nathan Smith, whose actions to actually sue the Obama administration for this is so important. Where you have somebody who recognizes the danger of this, along with some of the some of our elected officials and some of the public and some of our voices who spoke. And us, but actually doing something significant to try to intervene with this runaway train of military power. What's the status of that case? Like, what's going to come of that?
Well, the ironic thing is that Smith's challenge to the AUMF also centered around the 1973 War Powers Resolution. Was it
the previous weapon in America's illegal perpetual war, right?
And that was, to prevent, as you say, usurping Congress's authority to fight war. That resolution said that Congress would have 30 days to authorize a war that the president started, and if the president did not cease at that time,
if they voted no,
he would have to. I mean, some people argue that the president can continue for maybe like another 30 days as an extension. But at that point, the government, in order to fight war, you need to have money. That money is appropriated by Congress. Right. So Congress could just say, hey, we're going to leave the bank dry. You're not going to have any money to fight this war. So that's sort of one of Smith's arguments, is that.
If anyone is to question the legality of something like this, I would think it's somebody who's actually risking their life in the field, fighting this war.
Right. It's almost like the protests tying into another social issue, Kaepernick taking a silent, taking a knee and protesting silently, and people objecting to that and saying, well, that's not how you should protest. And then, okay, so we'll march in the streets and we'll, protest that way. And they say, well, you shouldn't protest that way. You're causing a disruption. So it's like, how can I possibly protest this thing, right? So when you talk about this legality, this legal war situation, you have Congress people who are speaking up, and that's not going to work. We can't put that amendment into the resolution. No, we can't do it that way. Okay, so I'm going to leak some documents to WikiLeaks and let the world know what the United States is doing. No, that's treasonous. You can't do that either. So then you have Nathan Smith saying, well, then I'm going to do it the way I'm supposed to do it. I'm going to take it to court. We're going to do this and process this the right way because I'm an officer of the Army. I can't maintain my oath to a constitution if you're telling me to do things that are unconstitutional.
Right.
So that's the way to do it. Like you said, I'm risking my life. I signed my life to this government to protect this nation. I'm an all-in soldier. My family is military.
Third generation. I think.
Third generation.
His grandfather, his mom, his father, his sister.
Right.
All
I think his pet
military.
turtle was actually tried to enlist.
Yeah.
So he's all in. But he says, but you can't do it this way. This is going against the things we're fighting for, that Constitution, that democracy.
And that's what Smith told us in our interview with him. And I wish we could have put more of this stuff into the episode to add a little more context to why Smith decided to do it the way he did. But he said, as he looked at this And, he was sitting there in Kuwait. It's Operation Inherent Resolve. He's right there in the center of the ISIS war. And he said, it left me with a conundrum. He said, I was supportive of the military efforts, but he said I was not supportive of the process.
Right.
And that's exactly what we're talking about here. That's what we're trying to get across, is that it's not about whether you agree or disagree with the war. We're not prosecuting it according to the U.S. Constitution, which a lot of members of Congress scream and yell about when it has to do with, say, immigration or gun rights, or, whether gay people can get married, all these things that they yell and scream about.
The Constitution.
Your greatest responsibility as a member of Congress is the responsibility to declare war. And Congress has totally abdicated its duty, and we can say that confidently because they have. For over 16 years, they have not even had a full debate, about U.S. wars in Congress, despite the $1 trillion that have been spent, despite the death toll in terms of U.S. soldiers dying abroad. And we just, as we mentioned, had the U.S. soldiers in Niger who were killed, and we don't even know why they were killed, why they're even in Niger, what their mission was. You have the civilian casualties that we mentioned, people dying in the name of a war that Congress refuses to act upon.
I can't even return something to Walmart without a receipt. I mean, these are policies that are really important. These are protocols that are really, really important. I don't mean to make light of it.
No, and I think it's also important that we discuss this because I think I was listening to another podcast that I won't name, and
give him a shout out.
No, because it's not a nice thing. And one of the hosts, they were talking about Trump and what he's done over the last year, and all the chaos that was expected, whether that materialized or not. And one of the hosts said, well, at least we're not at war. And at that point, I was just shaking my head. I couldn't even listen to the rest of it. I said, wow, we are at war. And when you have a veteran...
We're at so many wars.
When you have a veteran journalist saying, well, at least we're not at war, I can't imagine what the American people are thinking. Are people sitting at home, they have their other responsibilities, other things they're dealing with.
Right.
Do they even know we're still at war? Do they know how many wars we're fighting?
Right.
Do they know how many people have died as a result of these wars? Do they know how much money has been spent because of these wars? So I think that's why it's important. I think it's important for people to understand that we're still fighting a war that started in 2001 in response to an attack that happened at home.
Well, as Rand Paul said in the episode, in his speech, these wars now no longer have anything to do with 9/11.
Nothing at all to do with 9/11. Right. We're just fighting these so-called associated forces, which I mentioned is not in the AUMF. The Obama administration sort of just made up. They were smart the way they do it. It became a marketing ploy where people actually believed that the term associated forces was in the AUMF. And it took one senator from Maine, Angus King, to actually lambast some of these officials over it, and it didn't lead to anything, obviously. But, look, as long as the people understand that these are wars that are going on, and maybe Chris could just talk about it briefly, we haven't declared war since 1942, since World War II.
Right,
we haven't officially declared war since 1942.
Yeah.
Yeah, and think of all the conflicts that we've fought since then.
Yeah, we actually call it the Vietnam War, the Iraq War. Like the word war is being used, and the word
war is being used. They call it the ISIS war.
Right, but of course it's not technically a war. So yeah, okay. Listen, as always, I learned a million things. You're right. I'm an average American person with, what do you say, other responsibilities and other concerns. And I know some of these things because I'm plugged in with you, brilliant men, but I don't know the extent of this. And so I hope all of our listeners now, if you listen to the episode and then you listen to this, it means you're concerned. It means you're engaged and that this is important to you. So we hope we shed some additional light on it. Obviously, there's things that you could do as a citizen, hopefully, to do your part to perhaps push back against this, contact your Congress people and your elected officials, and just stay engaged, stay informed. We'll do the best we can here at Newsbeat. I want to give a special shout out this episode to Greg Tannen. Greg Tannen was the featured musical guest. I feel like we're Saturday Night Live. Featured musical guest, Greg Tannen. We took it away from our normal hip-hop vibe. We a little more hip than hop this time. His contribution musically, as you heard throughout the episode, and of course his vocals and songwriting actually gave such a solemn touch that we needed for this episode. So it was a little departure from what we've normally done, but I'm really happy to have had his contribution. We thank him, and we hope that you enjoyed it as well. Any parting words on this? because I'm thinking we have 2 episodes by the end of the year, so 2 more by the end of the year. So get ready. We have one coming up beginning of December, and then a special edition. It's going to be longer. It's going to be more in depth, and it's going to have you on the edge of your seats. We appreciate you listening to everything we've done so far. We appreciate you listening to us today. Stay tuned for those new episodes. Follow us on social media, US Newsbeat on most things, including Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can search for Newsbeat Podcast. If you're trying to find us, you can email us and contact us. Give us some tips, man. If you think you have an idea, a piece of conventional wisdom that could be looked at a little bit differently, the kind of stuff we do, let us know. We'll be happy to listen to you and take your suggestions. usnewsbeat.com is where you find us on the web, and wherever you subscribe to your favorite podcasts. Newsbeat, 2 words. Tell your friends, share it on social media, tell your enemies. They need to learn this stuff too, and we'll be back very, very soon with our next episode. Am I forgetting anything?
If you run a giant company and you want to give us money, please contact.
Sponsors are welcome. Praise is always welcome. If you want to just let us know. Yeah, rate and review. Do all the things. And we'll be back with our very next episode very, very soon. Thank you for listening. Once again, for Chris Twarowski, Rashed Mian, I'm Mike Conforti, a.k.a. Manny Faces. Peace.
Newsbeat is produced and distributed by MP Studios, a division of Mori Publishing. The producer of Newsbeat is Michael Conforti. The editor-in-chief of Newsbeat is Christopher Twarowski. The managing editor of Newsbeat is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Mori. Show notes are available on usnewsbeat.com. Subscribe today on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.